I'm Alicia Hayes, and I'm a lecturer in modern slavery at the Wilberforce Institute, which is part of the University of Hull. I'm also a research fellow for the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre, where I lead the research that looks at the legal enforcement of modern slavery. So all my research is about modern slavery, human trafficking and exploitation, and I'm particularly interested in issues of agency, representation, identification, and also the links between conflict and modern slavery and exploitation. So I came to this research after having worked as a practitioner in the field of modern slavery, and I noticed that there was a real focus on identifying and combating trafficking as it was happening, which of course is really important. We need to identify it and support people out of exploitation. But what I was seeing was that there was really little conversation about prevention methods or root causes. And that's what led me into academia, into researching the relationship between conflict and modern slavery, where conflict can be understood as one of the root causes. One really interesting part of the research I found was that I'd understood conflict to be linked to armed violence and war, and really thought that, well, we all know what conflict means, we use it all the time. But actually, when I was reaching out to research participants, I didn't provide a definition of conflict. And when I was starting the interviews, it was clear that I was understanding conflict in a much narrower sense than they were. So people had identified that they'd lived through conflict, but in a really different sense to war. So things including familial conflict, where they've had a relationship breakdown in the family, or marital conflict, or employment conflict. So it made me realise that actually there was a much broader definition of conflict that I needed to use when it came to my research. But two really interesting findings came out of my research, and these were that conflict, no matter the definition behind it, comes down to two things. And one of them is that it reduces a person's agency, so it leaves people with limited choices, and often those choices all hold inherent risk. So they're in a situation where they've got to choose between poor options. And that can be particularly distressing, it can be particularly vulnerabilising if they're in a situation where they're choosing to stay in a dangerous situation or accept the offer of somebody that they don't really know or really trust. But this is the idea of this choiceless choice, where you've got to choose between the lesser of two evils. And then the other key finding was that conflict breaks down people's support networks. And again, that's regardless of the type of conflict that they're living through. And where we'd be able to turn to our friends and our family if we're in a dangerous situation or we need support or help with something, conflict really breaks down those support networks. It moves people away, it displaces people from their families and their friends, which means that you're more likely to turn to strangers for support. And this is a really great position for traffickers because they identify this breakdown in support and they can present themselves as new support networks and offer situations of support and offer ways out of this situation to people that they intend to exploit.
So can you tell us a little bit more about how the theme of displacement plays out in your research?
Sure, well in conflict, displacement is a really common theme, and particularly where somebody is in violent conflict. So they might be moved out of their home because there's a risk of bombings or violence and moved into maybe a tented community on a border town. And again, that's a really easy place for a trafficker to identify potential victims where they're not in a secure situation. There might not be running water, there might not be electricity or any legitimate job opportunities. So it's a perfect recruitment situation for a trafficker to identify those vulnerabilities, offer jobs which might be in a different place, and then move the people again to another country, another town in the same country, and exploit them for their own benefit. But I think something really interesting about exploitation in this situation is when someone's being moved out of a conflict situation to an exploitative labour, for example, situation, it can be really difficult for them to identify that they've been exploited, especially if the situation that they're in is actually preferable to the dangerous situation that they've left. And that can make it really difficult to identify that you are being exploited because you really believe that this person's helped you into a better situation, even though legally it fits the definition of modern slavery and that you are being exploited and deserve a minimum wage, reasonable working hours, holiday that they're not getting, but at least they're living in safety with a roof over their heads.